Welcome to the 8th Annual Seattle Area.
The Seattle Epidemiologic Research and Information Center, in collaboration with the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA Employee Education System, and the University of Washington Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, presents the 8th Annual Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session.
Good morning. Welcome to the 8th Annual Seattle ERIC Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session. My name is Ed Boyko. I am the course director. The title of today's course is Epidemiologic Aspects of Military Post-Deployment Health Conditions, Natural Disasters, and Terrorism. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dean Kilpatrick, a distinguished university professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and director of the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center at the Medical University of South Carolina. He and his colleagues have conducted epidemiologic studies of numerous disasters, including the Loma Prieta earthquake, Hurricanes Andrew and Hugo, the 2004 hurricanes in Florida, the Pan Am 103 terrorist bombing, and the 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. The title of his talk today is Epidemiologic Aspects of Natural Disasters. Dr. Kilpatrick.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back with you. What I want to do in this session is to finish up talking about some telephone survey methods, and then I want to get to some actual examples of use of telephone methods and some of the research that my colleagues and I have done. A good place to start would be to say that there is an opinion by a lot of people, unfortunately a lot of them who sit on IRBs, that somehow talking to people on the telephone about bad things that may have happened to them is somehow unduly stressful and almost rises to the level of cruel and unusual punishment. However, as I think it was Henry Kissinger once said, that you may be entitled to your own opinions, but you are not entitled to your own facts. And so what I'd like to do is just to briefly address that issue about human subjects protection issues for telephone interviews. There's really not a lot of data. In fact, there's no data suggesting that if a telephone survey, even about very, very traumatic things, is well done, that it produces long-term distress in individuals who are being interviewed. The situations themselves are very stressful. I mean, in other words, it's very bad to be in a hurricane, it's bad to be sexually assaulted, it's bad to have a lot of these things happen to you. However, being interviewed about those is not one of the things that's particularly bad. And I'm going to present a little data in just a second. Having said all that, we always, in our surveys, anticipate the fact that we may run into the odd case where somebody is upset and does need some type of help. And so what we do is we do two things. One, we do a series of debriefing questions at the end of the interviews in which we ask people, are you upset? Was there anything in the interview that upset you? Are you still upset now? And do you want to see a counselor? We feel like the Maytag repairman a little bit in those old commercials where they're sitting around waiting for the phone to ring and it never rings. You can anticipate that maybe one or two cases out of every 1,000 people you might get some type of response and have to talk to somebody, but in most cases that's about as far as it gets. And most of us would feel that that's a pretty low risk situation. Let me just illustrate that with some data, and I hope you can see this, but these are actually from the New York after 9/11 studies that I'm going to be mentioning to you in just a minute. But basically what it showed is that at the end of the interview it asked people, were there any parts of it that were emotionally upsetting to you? Yes, no. Then were you still upset at the end of the interview? And then would you like to to get some type, or would you like to talk to a counselor? By the way, if you would like to talk to a counselor, then they're asked, is this something that's emergent? Do you need this right this minute, or would the next business day be okay? And long story short, there were over 5,774 people interviewed as a part of this survey. And basically, there were 33 who wanted to talk to a counselor. And of those 33, it strikes me that there might have been about 8 who wanted to talk to somebody right away. Now, I would submit to you that that's a pretty low risk ratio. And so what a lot of survey researchers are doing now is they're beginning to add questions similar to this to the end of interviews so that they can, and they're beginning to publish actually data suggesting that, that it's really not that upsetting to people. And again, I think sooner or later, the people at the IRBs will have to pay some attention to this, we hope. Although IRBs are sort of regulated, but it's interesting, they're not overly accountable in a lot of ways, at least I find, but that's just me. Let me conclude talking about some general issues about telephone interviewing by mentioning a couple of things. One, there's something that's called computer-assisted telephone interviewing, or CATI, as it's called, or CATI, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And basically, a lot of telephone interviews now are done using highly structured interview scripts, so that basically what the investigator does is that you design the interview to be conducted verbatim the way that you would like to have it conducted. And that includes training the interviewers to be able to conduct that the exact way that you want to do it. So the way that works is that basically you enter the script for the interview along with skip patterns and everything else into a computer program. The person doing the telephone interview is sitting in a carrel and basically with a telephone in one hand or a headset and looking at a computer screen in the other. The interview pops up on the screen, and then basically what the interviewer is supposed to say is on the screen as well as the response options. So there are many advantages of that approach, which includes you can put complex skip patterns in there, which are often difficult, and you find out when some interviewer has missed a page of the interview or forgot to go here or there, depending on what happened, only when you're coding your data. So in other words, you can have those skip patterns. You can say, well, all right, if there's 5 PTSD symptoms that are checked yes within the last 6 months, then ask these follow-up questions about did they all go together, or was there some sort of functional impairment. So there are really some very nice things you can do. If people have reported a lot of potentially traumatic experiences as a part of an interview, and you want to find out the conditional probability of having PTSD given exposure to one of these types of things, you can randomly select one. You can also, if you're worried about order effects, you can present questions in different sequences for different parts of the study. There's a lot of very nice things that you can do. In terms of coding coding errors, you can't totally ever eliminate anything, but by having options that are out of range and having it query things, or even if they said, well, I was born in 1943 and I'm 30 years old in another part of the interview, it can code to pop up and try to resolve some of those things. So there's a lot of advantages to that approach. It does also provide a lot of control, or more control, over interviewer behavior because of the standardization of how questions are presented. It makes it very difficult if you say, well, this is a little old lady and I'm just don't feel comfortable asking her about if she's ever been sexually assaulted, so I think I'll just skip over that question. It becomes much more difficult to do that. And then there's some of the CATIE programs that will also generate, the telephone numbers in a random fashion. I mean, so that it can help with actually drawing the sample. And it also can provide information on the length of each interview question, as well as the entire interview in a real-time basis. So when we're piloting things, they may do 100 interviews as a pilot, and they can tell us exactly how long the interview is and how long each section is. So, I mean, it's really got a lot of data control there. A lot of the CATIE interview setups that are used by commercial survey research firms actually also have a situation where a supervisor can listen in on the interview, see what the interviewers are supposed to be saying and doing, and then hear what they're actually doing in a real-time basis. I, in South Carolina, in Charleston, can listen to one of my studies being conducted in New York or Florida. I can be patched in and I can hear actually the data being collected. Now, when you're doing in-person interviewing, particularly out in the community, guess what? You have no idea what your interviews are doing. You would be shocked and appalled, probably, if you found that out. So, in other words, there's a level of control that you can have in this situation as an investigator over what the interviewer is doing that is not possible otherwise. Everything has advantages and disadvantages, and telephone interviewing is no exception. First of all, it's a cost-effective way to assess people in large sampling frames over large geographic areas, which is why for most of the federal government, most all the studies have gone to telephone simply because the difficulties of in-person are so it's so costly. Minimizes travel time and travel cost required for in-person surveys, and the larger the geographical area that you're trying to cover, the bigger the advantage is for telephone. Imagine you go to a household, that's a designated household, you're supposed to be interviewing somebody, they're not there. You hop in your car, you go back, then you go back some other time, and you're back and forth and back and forth. Whereas it's much easier to do a repeat attempt to contact people when all you're doing is calling them on the telephone. If you do the telephone interviewing in a centralized facility, it really facilitates the ability to do surveys in different languages. Now imagine without having to have multilingual interviewers. So imagine that you're trying to do a study and you've got all of this stuff going on, and you have 3 or 4 languages you're trying to do, and the interviewer encounters a language that they're not familiar with. Well, then what do? You have to go back to central headquarters, find somebody who speaks that language, get them to come out. Whereas if you're in a centralized facility, you encounter a Spanish-speaking person, you say, well, I can't do it very well because I don't speak Spanish, but un momento, por favor, and then you go to the next carol, get the Spanish-speaking interview. It pops to the Spanish interview, and you're off and running. So, in other words, there's some real advantages to that. And as I mentioned, it's particularly good if a survey is being conducted over a large geographic area, because if you're doing a national study, for example, most people would say you need a minimum of 50 primary sampling units, and so, I mean, you've got to either locate, train local people, at each of those sites, you've got to supervise them, you've got to do all that, as opposed to having it all located in a centralized facility. And actually, this may be counterintuitive, but it permits access to otherwise hard-to-reach respondents. And again, if you're trying to do an in-person survey and you're trying to survey a central city site, for example, and let's say it's a high-crime area, and let's say, or it's a gated community where nobody gets in. I mean, so there are barriers to being able to get up and knock on somebody's door and to ask them if they want to participate, whereas with the telephone, it's actually less of a barrier. So even though that may be counterintuitive, I think it's nonetheless true. There are some disadvantages to telephone, however. First of all, telephone interviewers must be shorter, than in-person interviews. I mean, you can have long ones, but the real issue is people don't like to have the phone tied up. And it requires a bit more concentration, I think, than an in-person interview does. So typically they're shorter. However, with the CATIE, basically you can collect an awful amount of information, in a fairly short period of time. Obviously, if you don't have a telephone, you're not living in a household, you're excluded. But this may be less of a problem than most people think. I mean, again, if you assume that maybe there's 5% of the U.S. 5 to 6% of the U.S. population that does not live in households with telephones, it would require a huge difference in prevalence between that 5% and the 95% to be able to shift an overall estimate. And you also have to ask yourself, what are the alternatives? If you don't live in households, if you're interested in sampling homeless people or homeless veterans, let's say, neither of these methods is going to work very well, but you have to develop an entirely new sampling frame for it. Web-based methods are even cheaper than telephone because once you've developed a survey, it costs virtually nothing to maintain it and to build on it. But even though a higher proportion of people than used to, and particularly among some groups, have access to the web, it's still not as great a percentage as have access to telephones. And there may be some differences between people who are web-enabled or households that are web-enabled and those that aren't. So, and if you look at some of the panels, it's almost like some of the people are professional subjects these days, and there's some questions about how many enroll in a panel in the first place, and then what is the rate of people who who basically are on a web-enabled panel who agree to participate in a given study. So again, I think that this is a huge wave of the future in terms of web-based, but we may not be totally there yet in terms of some things, although combining it with other things. Yes, a question.
When I was working in the Houston Astrodome after Katrina, as a social worker, we did outreach for the VA. There was a large number of people who went out and bought the prepaid cell phones, and then they were also, displaced. And so I was trying to figure out how would CATIE, well, I don't know, we manually went out and asked people for their phone numbers and stuff, but I'm wondering how the telephone surveying, if it's caught up to that cell phone. And also veterans here in the Seattle area, some of them are moving to cell phone only.
Right. Well, the cell phone issue is going to be a big issue, and it's getting to be there now. And in fact, there are some surveys that I've read, or some studies that I've read after Katrina that actually did include cell phones as a part of a survey. And technically, the law in the U.S. is that you cannot dial a number automatically. I mean, in other words, they have automatic dialing situations, and the law actually prohibits that. What it was trying to do was not kill survey researchers, it was trying to kill marketers, telemarketers, which I guess we are all in favor of, unless we're trying to sell something. But frankly, so it is not illegal to call cell phones, and actually a lot of the studies that have been done after 9/11, or some of those that have included cell phones, have basically been done on the basis of a list sample. And so what they've done is they've used telephone not to randomly dial telephones or cell phones, but to basically include those as a part of that. And if there are a lot of minutes included, or you can pay people for the minutes or things like that, then it would not necessarily, exclude those.
I have a question. Have there been any validity studies comparing the data that you're getting from these shorter telephone-based interviews with longer in-person interviews?
Yes, there have, and short answer. If you'd like me to elaborate, I will. There have been several studies that have been done actually in which they've used the same assessment methods, or similar assessment method, and just varied the modality. And what they find basically is that you get comparable results with respect to anything unless it's a sensitive topic. And if it's a sensitive topic, the anonymity of telephone actually seems to encourage more ability to self-report. If you're talking about diagnoses, DSM-4 diagnoses or things like that, you get comparable data. And there have been several studies looking at a variety of things that have shown that. Actually, one real advantage of a computer, an actual computer thing, is that seems to get the highest disclosure for sensitive topics of all. And NIDA has actually funded some studies where they're looking at getting people to self-report alcohol and drug use. And the way that lays out is that if it's a self-administered computer thing, you get the highest rates of disclosure for these sensitive topics, and then telephone is second, and in-person is third. And now that's really different from what most clinicians think, and I'm a clinician too, so I would add myself to that category, is that we think that if we're laying eyes on somebody, we can get them to be more honest in terms of their disclosure. However, if it's a stigmatizing, sensitive topic, it appears the more anonymity you can give people, the better it is. If it's asking about symptoms or diagnoses, actually there doesn't seem to be a lot of difference. Okay. Now, one thing that's happened is that the rates of participation in telephone surveys have been falling overall. In other words, the proportion of people contacted who are willing to participate and complete an interview has been going down, but there's some recent research suggesting that doesn't really seem to have you'd always rather have a higher response rate than a lower response rate, I think you would agree. And it's more valid, we would think, with the higher participation rate. But it doesn't look like that's producing bias, at least in some of the recent work that's been done. Let me move along then and talk about some of the research that my colleagues and I have done to try to illustrate this. I've given you a lot of just sort of general stuff, but I'd like to actually get to some real studies and some real data here in this next section. And what I'm going to do is talk about our Hurricane Hugo and Loma Prieta studies, the LA riot study that we did, some work in New York about the September 11th terrorist attacks, and then some really hot off the press information about a hurricane project that we just completed down in Florida. And I'll go through this kind of quickly, but I think I had previously mentioned that we got interested in hurricanes when one hit us, basically, which is, by the way a lot of people get involved in disaster research, is that you could care less about it when it happens to you, then it becomes a very, very important thing. Hurricane Hugo was big and bad, and this illustrates how big and bad it was, and that's poor little South Carolina that you can barely see. That's when the eye of this hurricane was over Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. So you can kind of get a notion for how big that storm was. I'll give you some facts and figures in just a minute. But this is used to be a boat harbor that was about a half a mile down the waterway, and it just took all the boats and deposited them. And this is like half of the picture. It was an awful lot of dead boats that happened after that. This is where I live, Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. As you can see, it's a barrier. Well, you can't see. It's a barrier island, but I think you can get some sort of notion about the level of destruction that was happening, after this storm. Is that there's a lot more debris than there is houses, and there used to be houses where there's a lot of these piles of stuff now. This is just another view of Sullivan's Island. So it was pretty bad. This is just a building that was sort of a commercial building that got whacked pretty badly. This is downtown Charleston for anybody who has been there. The building there is the convention center, which used to be the Omni Hotel, and this just shows that in downtown Charleston there was a lot of damage. And then I think this really more poignantly illustrates the problem on a personal level, that here's a fellow who probably didn't have a whole lot of stuff going into this hurricane, and that's pretty much what he's got left. And then what you've got to deal with after that, which is how do you put your life back together when you don't really have very much, and what little you had you don't have anymore. So a cognitive strategy that we used following the hurricane was one that a lot of pointy-headed intellectuals used, which is basically to try to distract ourselves from the other kind of stuff we had going on. We said, well, there's a lack of research here, and we need to do a study. This is really, really important, and we need to do this. If you find yourself in a disaster situation, you may find yourself having the same thought processes. Now, when we looked at the literature at that point, we saw several problems. One was that Hugo really impacted a very large area. I mean, actually there were hurricane force winds 200 miles from the coast in Charlotte, and actually there was a lot of damage done in Charlotte. I can attest to that because my family and I evacuated, and damned if the hurricane didn't come up to Charlotte to get us. So hit us in the back on the way up the interstate. But at any rate, it was very big, and over 3/4, or really about 2/3 of the counties in the whole state of South Carolina, not just the coast, were declared disaster areas as a function of the storm. And then, with notable exceptions, most disaster research at that point were atheoretical. In other words, it was just like, well, we'll study this disaster, and somebody else will study that disaster. But there were no common themes. There was no attempt to sort of compare, what are the common factors here that we might use to understand the effects of disasters. Now, as luck would have it, about 3 weeks after Hugo, the Loma Prieta earthquake happened in the Bay Area of San Francisco. So what occurred to us is that given the fact that these are two very large-scale disasters, that it might give us the opportunity to really compare these two things and see if there were some common factors. And there's some real differences, obviously, between earthquakes and hurricanes. I mean, you don't get notice about earthquakes, so you can't evacuate, and there's some other differences there. So we decided to write a grant, which was funny anyway at the time when we're sort of mentally impaired trying to write this grant application. As a result, it took us 3 times to get it funded, but we finally did get it funded by NIMH, and we're very grateful for that. And so we actually had hooked up with some researchers at the University of South Carolina, which is different from the Medical University of South Carolina, who had been doing disaster work as well. Now, Hugo, here's the figures. I mean, there were like 135-mile-an-hour sustained winds with some 160-mile-an-hour gust. There was a 5 to 20-foot storm surge, depending on where exactly you were. In South Carolina, where I live, is called the Low Country for a reason. Ain't no uphill there. It's just like flat. So 20 feet of water in is a lot of water. There wasn't as much rain as some other storms because the storm was moving fairly quickly. There were about $6 billion in damages, and that was in 1989 dollars, not 2006 dollars. There were 68 deaths, and most of those actually happened after the storm due to stupid Bubba tricks with trying to operate a chainsaw with one hand, and I mean, there are just all kinds of things that happen after. I mean, some guy literally cut his head off with a chainsaw because you learn about chainsaw etiquette, and it's basically you keep both hands on it, because if the blade snaps, it pops back, and that can ruin your whole day. And there were about 60,000 to 70,000 homeless in the Charleston area. Now, the Loma Prieta earthquake was a 7.1 on the Richter scale. It was about 10 seconds of very intense shaking, and there were some stories that people told about that, like bouncing back and forth in the elevators, which would be unnerving at the least. Again, the damage toll was similar, a little higher because there was more infrastructure that got damaged, as I'll show you in a minute. Death toll was about the same, which is low compared to the amount of damage and everything else that was going on. And there were about 13,000 homeless. This is the freeway that collapsed, which actually killed most of the people and was responsible for a lot of the damage. This was the Mission District, where, again, a lot of the land liquefied and the buildings that were not built for standing earthquakes collapsed. I mean, that's one of the worst places of damage there as well. So anyway, what we used to approach this was a theoretical model that said that there were, I mean, in a simplest vein, there were some pre-disaster factors that we thought would influence response to the disasters. There were some within disaster factors, which included appraisal of danger, how afraid you were, hardships that were produced by the disaster in terms of just damage and whatnot, and then exposure to injury or death. Did you see dead people? Did you see people who were injured? Were you injured yourself, etc.? And then there were some mediating factors, which would be this peritraumatic emotional reactions, post-disaster life events, like how bad was the recovery environment, and then resource loss, which we talked about some in a previous lesson, and then basically coping behavior and contact with support organizations. Like we, felt like that if you got good support from the Red Cross or FEMA or other people, that would help a lot. And then the main things we were looking at were post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. I'll go through this kind of quickly, but basically this was the sampling strategy that we used, which is basically we were looking at 5 counties surrounding the Bay Area and then 2 counties in South Carolina. One, Sumter County, is about 100 miles inland, and a lot of people evacuated there thinking that they were safe, and then they got whammed pretty badly. And the building codes were not great on the coast, but they were better than they were inland, and so there was actually a lot of damage to that county. So basically, long story short, we identified telephone exchanges within the areas that had been affected and then did random digit dial and whatnot to locate households and then interview people within the households. At the end of the day, we had 776 adults from Charleston, from South Carolina rather, and then 1,008 adults from California. And basically, the reason why the numbers were different is that we had this great idea where we're going to get a controlled city, that was threatened by the hurricane, and so we had 225 roughly from Savannah, Georgia, which did not get hit. But it turned out Savannah, even though it's 100 miles down the coast, was very different demographically from Charleston. So that part seemed like a good idea at the time. It didn't work out. This is the demographics of the group, and basically no difference in terms of gender, in terms of education. Basically, Californians were better educated than South Carolinians, which we knew and we were sort of sorry about, but nonetheless it was true. The ethnicity basically reflected the ethnicity of both of the groups as well. I mean, the 2 different samples. I mean, more African Americans in South Carolina and basically more Asians and Hispanics in California. The age, actually, South Carolina sample was a little older as well, but not hugely so. And again, these are all 18 and older, so that's why the age looks high. The interviewing, as this is true of all the studies I'm going to be talking about, was done by SRBI, which is a national survey research firm. This interview was long. I mean, it was 40 minutes long, which is way long for a telephone interview. It was done by Katie, and we did it in either English or Spanish. And because of the lack of recognizing what a great opportunity this was on the part of the review committees at NIMH, we had hoped to get in a lot quicker than this, but it really was 18 to 24 months post-disaster, so it was a fairly long time after the disaster before we were actually able to do the study. So we weighted the data to control for the oversampling of the highly affected areas, and so these estimates then could really be applied to the counties in question. Now to actual findings. And again, I'll go through these kind of quickly, but basically there was no difference between the two in terms of high magnitude events, which are really kind of called PTSD criterion A events. I mean, you know, major types of traumatic things that might have happened prior to the disaster. And in the events with life threat, that even though this was done slightly before the DSM-4, we did have some events. I mean, we did ask them, well, were you afraid you would be killed during these events or seriously injured? And so it's kind of criterion A1, A2 for those diagnostic fans of the DSM-4. So anyway, no differences between the two groups. When you looked at their appraisal of danger, actually there were some differences in that people were actually scareder, or more of the people were scared during the hurricane that they would be seriously injured or killed than during the earthquake. And then a big issue, and this is true of terrorism, disasters, or anything, one thing that really is a very big stressor for people when it happens, even if they're okay, they worry about their families and friends if they're separated. And so that's something that in both cases people were, even though they were okay, they said, well, I was afraid about, that a family member might be seriously injured or killed. And then the other question was, looking back on it now, and remember this is 18 months to 24 months later, you've still got a situation in which people are saying, well, do you think you were really safe or not, looking back on it? And so there was a difference there in terms of, about a third of the people in South Carolina said, yeah, looking back on it, I really was in danger. I mean, even, 18 months, 2 years later, I really think I was in danger. And that was a higher percentage than was true for the California sample. If you looked at the damages that were actually produced, you can see that in the South Carolina, there was a lucky 7.3% who said that my home got no damages at all. And then that's just sort of the breakdown of the rest of them. And so basically, I mean, when you're talking about an epi sample too, I mean, you're not just going out looking for people who got hurt, but I mean the fact that 1 in 5, or actually almost 30%, had either moderate to major damage in South Carolina to their home, I mean, it's an indicant of how bad it was. If you looked at without utilities for more than a week, 70% of the South Carolina sample basically was out without electricity for at least a week. As I say, it was morning in America when we got our electricity back on, which was between 3 and 4 weeks after the disaster. Even though the house, I didn't get back into my house for 9 months and felt lucky compared to a lot of people. But it was still nice when the house got the electricity back on. I mean, even though we couldn't live in it, it was a nice thing. And then telephone, and water were not really that big a deal. Well, I guess water actually was for some people, but at any rate. And then these are just some things about emotional reactions, object loss, personal and social resource loss, coping behavior, and whatnot. And there were some differences there between the two samples with, in general, more of those kinds of loss items in South Carolina than in California. Here's the overall prevalence data. What we found is that a lifetime estimate of PTSD, no differences on any of these variables, by the way, across the two samples. But 10% in South Carolina, 11.3% in California. In terms of post-disaster PTSD, it was about 5%, 1 in 20 in South Carolina, 5.7, about the same amount in California. And then for major depression, the interesting thing to me was that post-disaster, 11% of the people had some depression after the disaster. And that 11% may not sound like much, but when you start applying it to the population base of these two places, it's really an awful lot of people. But again, no significant differences across the two disasters. So in terms of findings, again, this study is not in any way definitive at all, but it does begin to show, I think it has some interesting things in it. One is that using this telephone method and sampling, even if it's a while after the disasters, you can pick up some differences across these disasters in terms of the pattern and level of disaster exposure. And I've already kind of described these, and I won't read it to you, but basically it kind of does talk about some of the issues there. Lifetime rates of PTSD among adults were slightly higher than some national estimates, including, mostly the National Comorbidity Study of Ron Kessler. And, when you're doing something like this, it's always difficult to say, well, gee, is that due to the hurricane, or the earthquake, or is it due to just some demographic differences, between these areas of South Carolina and California? And the short answer is, I don't know. But at any rate, I still don't know. It's been a long time later, and I still don't know. It did look somewhat elevated, however. And then the important thing is if you're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, and you're saying a current rate of 1 in 20, 5%, 5% of that population area is a lot of people. So it's saying that even that long afterwards, that there's still a problem with a lot of people having post-traumatic stress disorder, and even about twice as many having major depression. Let me change to another project, and I'm not going to go through it in the same depth, but this was, how many of you remember the Rodney King case? Yeah, most everybody. At any rate, the synopsis of that is, on April 29th, there were 4 police officers who beat severely on TV. Well, actually it was a videotape that was then on TV a lot. Rodney King, and then there were riots that occurred following, I think, the acquittal of the individuals, who were charged with that. And basically, it was mostly in South Central LA, but there were 53 deaths, there was arson, there were looting, there was widespread TV coverage of that. And a lot of injuries, jobs lost, and a fair amount of damages. And while most of the actual rioting or civil disturbances happened there in the South Central area, it actually was viewed over the entire LA County. And so we really wanted to do 2 things as a part of this study. One, we wanted to compare the prevalence of exposure to previous traumatic events and to the riots among adults in South Central as well as the rest of LA. And secondly, we wanted to see if this recent exposure to the riots increased the risk of PTSD when you controlled for all these background variables. And actually, let me say, there's a grant program called the RAPID program, which stands for something, and it's NIMH. And it's and at the time this happened, it was they had a quick turnaround time, pretty fast application, and the idea was to get in the field quickly to collect data, and the limit was $50,000. And so we got a $50,000 grant to do the study that I'm going to be talking to you about right now. So the sampling frame in this study was basically 800 people from South Central. We sort of oversampled South Central. and then 400 from the rest of LA, so 1,200 overall. We used random digit dial to locate households. We conducted the interview in English and Spanish. And these were actually done 6 to 8 months afterwards, which is kind of in the fast lane compared to usually getting any type of funding out of a funding agency and actually doing the study. And again, the participation rate was almost 82%, suggesting to me that this was a very interesting and relevant thing to most of the people, so therefore they were willing to participate. These are just some comparisons of LA County in comparing the South Central with the rest of LA County. And have you been a victim of violent crime in the past year? Have you witnessed severe violence in the past year? Have you suffered either the homicide death of a family member or friend, either due to murder or due to alcohol-related vehicular homicide? And so the Chamber of Commerce probably would not, of LA, would probably not want us to include this information on their promotional materials about visiting or living in LA, but pretty violent place before the riots ever happened. Then during the disturbances or the riots, did you lose phone? Did you lose electrical coverage? Did you have no water? What you can see is that actually in South Central about 1 in 5 households lost phones and electricity, and those were higher in the affected areas, which makes sense. But sometimes it's nice to look at these things because, you know, what would have happened if we had found something different? I mean, that did not comport with, you know, the truth on the ground as we knew them. How about no food? I mean, there were, again, that was higher in South Central. Schools were closed, and then no access to health care in their neighborhoods. Then that, you know, again, those were big differences between the two. Did your neighborhoods, because of the disturbances, lose businesses, places to shop, medical clinics, or other stores? So again, you know, it's kind of illustrating the fact that due to these disturbances, a lot of people in South Central had a worse time of it than in the rest of LA. During the disturbances, did you personally feel like your life was in danger? And again, a fairly large proportion, nearly half of the sample thought that they were. And somewhat surprisingly, to me at least, that although maybe not, in the rest of LA, even though they were not really affected, people were saying, you know, that they really were scared of this, that it would spread to their areas and that they would be harmed themselves. And again, this issue about people are actually more concerned about the safety of their family members than they are personally. I mean, like, I know what my own situation is, but if I'm separated from my family, I don't really have a clue as to what, are any of you worriers? Do you worry about your family? I see some nodding and bobbing here, but so again, this really is a key issue in the disasters. Now, this was an interesting study, and I'm not going to have a chance to get into a lot of other things in there, but we did ask a lot about racial attitudes, about perceptions of prejudice on the part of law enforcement and you know, shop owners and all that. There's a very rich data. But what we really found there in terms of PTSD was that basically in logistic regressions predicting current PTSD, lifetime traumatic events that you'd had prior to the riots made a difference. Other stressful events that did not rise to the level of sort of PTSD criterion A events made a difference in terms of PTSD likelihood. Past year violent crime victimization, so if they had been a violent crime victim, that made a difference. And then also several of these measures of exposure to the riots. So what we concluded as a part of that study was that basically all of these things were important, and that exposure to the riots on top of all this other stuff still made a difference even when you controlled for everything else. Let me quickly move to another study. This was interesting in that basically, and this is the description of the Pan Am 103 terrorist bombing, but it exploded on this flight over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 259 people who were in the plane, which included a lot of Americans who basically were studying abroad and who were coming home over the Christmas holidays. And then prior to September 11th, this was the deadliest terror attack in U.S. history. There was this protracted, very complicated international set of circumstances back and forth around the handling of this case. But partially in response to this, the U.S. Office for Victims of Crime, which is in the Justice Department, was authorized to provide a number of services about 5 or 6 years into the case to the family members of this. And it was really a first-class bunch of services. And this was, a few times in your life does something happen like this, but happened to be in D.C. and was visiting the Office for Victims of Crime about another matter. And Catherine Turman, who was the director, said, we really are doing all these services for these folks, and we don't really know if it's working well or not. Would you be interested in doing a study if we gave you the money? And I said, oh, well, tell you what, let me think about it, yes. And it was a miracle because basically they wanted the study done, and so it was kind of like, you got the money, we got the time, as the old country song goes. And I mean, I must say that it's really unusual also for a federal agency that doesn't have to do so to say, we're really curious about how well this is working. So I really, admire and respect them for doing that. Anyway, what we did, they had a list sample of 300 family members, or of family members rather. It was more than 300. That in some cases they'd had one person killed, in some cases they'd had more than one person killed in the family that they had on this list. We were able to locate 300 of those family members, and again, it was the rate was a little less, but remember, all of these people have suffered the death. I mean, actually not just the injury, but a death of a family member. And so it was about 71% participation rate, which ain't bad, I mean, given the nature of what had happened. And we actually did a second follow-up interview with a subset of those after the verdicts actually came down in the case. So we conducted these in the fall of 2000 and in the spring of 2001. So this is about all between 11 and 12 years after this event happened, just to give you a time frame. One thing that I'm not going to show you, people loved all the services. I mean, they were very appreciative of these services, and they just thought they were important and rated them very well, even though they did give us some feedback as to how they could be improved. One thing that's interesting is that only 6% of the family members reported having used the Office for Victims of Crime funded Crime Victim Compensation Fund for mental health counseling. They could have as much mental health counseling as they wanted. They could go to anybody they wanted to, as often as they wanted to, whatever. It would be paid for. Remove the barriers, really, to mental health care. But only 6% reported having ever used this. Now, the problem is this didn't come into effect until 6 or 7 years after the crash happened. And so it could have been that if that had been available right away, I suspect more than 6% would have used it. But that was the least utilized of all the services they provided. Almost half of them said that they had emotional or behavioral problems sufficiently bad that they considered seeking mental health treatment. But only 36% actually had sought any treatment at all. However, the good news is that of the people who did get some treatment, most of them really thought it was either very helpful or somewhat helpful. So it's kind of like, if you can get them to go, they're going to, I don't know if they really benefit. I mean, liking a treatment is not the same thing as it being effective, but it's a start. And so, people who actually went, most of them thought it was helpful. The main reason that I wanted to show you this from the Pan Am study, though, is why people said that family members do not seek mental health counseling. And this is like not why I didn't personally, but why do you think folks like you don't take advantage of this? People can handle it on their own with support of family, friends, or through religious faith. There's a stigma attached to mental health treatment. Counseling is a sign of weakness. They would have to say that they had mental health treatment on job applications. And again, here's a group of people who, I mean, can you imagine anything worse happening than has happened to each one of these individuals? And they still think that there's so much stigma attached to having to get some help from that. I mean, to me, it's just a very, I mean, there's other data from other studies that show the same thing, but it's just, you know, it's pretty powerful. In some cases, they said, well, I didn't do it because, or people didn't do it because they couldn't afford it or have poor insurance. Nobody can relate to that, I guess. And then they're in denial or could not admit that they had a problem. So I think this is just an interesting snapshot, which is why I'm showing it to you, about what you probably would anticipate seeing in a lot of disaster victims, and that, you know, even those who may need treatment are not going to be willing to get it. Let me move quickly into some information about the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York. This was the largest disaster to date in U.S. history. There were about 2,800 people who were killed in New York, and about 12,000 relatives. About an equal number of people were injured. I mean, usually you get an injured ratio to killed that's a lot larger, but again, New York, I mean, because the building collapsed, I mean, in most cases you either made it or you didn't in terms of that, and there weren't as many injuries as people were expecting. Another thing is that if you were in New York City, the disruption, the chaos, the reminders of that were just everywhere, and it was just very pervasive. So it had a lot of effect above and beyond, you know, the effect of those people who were directly involved. So I think with that, this concludes this session, and we will return during the next session to give you more information.